Imagine you had to design the ideal car. It would have to carry 4 people and their luggage, be economical, handle precisely and safely, be value for money, be so well engineered it could cover 150,000 miles. It would also have to be formidably fast, fashionable, and fun to drive and own. Well, it's already been done a couple of decades ago, and you're looking at it. Let me introduce you to the world's most complete car, the original Golf GTI. Because we see something every day, we take it for granted. What's familiar becomes commonplace. With the passage of time, we've forgotten that VW's boxy little roller skate was a car apart, the first to give power to the people.
The biggest thing the GTI did was to sell car enthusiasm to people who didn't even know they were interested in either cars or driving.
I would summarise the GTI by saying that it was the best car that I've ever driven.
In the future, I think that we may try a Mark III Golf GTI, but I'll still keep my Mark I because I think that it is actually the best crackerjack hot hatch in the world.
This is the story of one of the most influential and widely imitated motor cars in the world, and one that kick-started an entirely new motoring craze. From a culture of Prussian perfection came a trend-setting pocket rocket that gave birth to that 80s phenomenon, the hot hatch. And it's a car that very nearly didn't happen. In the beginning, there was a man who dreamed of a car for the people, a man who nearly always got what he wanted. The only good dream Hitler ever had, the Beetle went on to become the most popular car in the world. But by the late 60s, VW realized that they'd relied on their pensionable cherub a decade too long. So in desperation, they launched a modern Beetle, the 411, which promptly bombed. Then they tried their calamitous K70, which also bombed spectacularly. By the early 70s, they were seriously in the sherbet dip. Their model range was dull. There was a worldwide energy crisis, and they were bleeding 800 million Deutschmarks a year. It was time for something completely different. VW never imagined that their light, strong and sensible Golf would become the perfect platform for a hot rod. As early as 1969, they commissioned an air-cooled front-wheel drive Beetle replacement, the prototype of which was startlingly ugly. VW tried again, not altogether successfully. Eventually, German pragmatism gave way to Italian flair. It was Giorgetto Giugiaro of Beetle Design who came up with the shape of the car that was so perfectly in tune with its times.
He's off in that new car again. Wouldn't catch me in a Volkswagen.
What's wrong with the Golf?
Well, it's not exactly big, is it?
Actually, it's bigger than it looks.
He'll never get that lot in there. Anyway, I don't like rear-engine cars.
The engine's in the front. It's water-cooled. Back seats fold down too.
Yeah, you seem to know a lot about his car. You've been in his car.
For Volkswagen, the mid-70s were the boom years. They had a massive success on their hands. The world was buying the Golf as if it was the only car on the planet. And 2.5 years later, they'd sold 1 million. The Golf put Volkswagen back into profit, but there were a few enlightened souls who reckoned it was capable of even more. A team of 6 of VW's motorsport engineers came up with a brilliant idea. They would soup up the Golf. They would make it go like lightning. They spent their evenings, weekends and spare time stiffening the car, stripping it out, adding petrol injection, and they instantly created a classic. But they had one big problem: convincing everybody else.
You could buy cars with high acceleration, but these high acceleration cars always have been connected and offered by a brand with a specific image, like BMW and Porsche. But a brand which is called Volkswagen, people's car, and to offer people's car with such an advantage in performance was somewhat for us that didn't fit together. And the engineers finally convinced us, and so far we tried it.
And it was one of VW's better decisions, because the new hot Golf caused apoplexy in the motoring press. Here was a car that was all things to all men. Yet without those determined engineers, VW would have let one of the world's greatest cars slip through their fingers. A potential error rivaled only by the bloke from Decca who said no to the Beatles. But mercifully, VW backed it all the way, and the first GTI squealed onto German autobahns in 1976. It wowed everybody. I know, because I was there. In '76, I was going out with a German girl who had one of the first GTIs. I remember we were sitting at a set of traffic lights in downtown Munich when up pulls this bloke in a Merc. I looked at him. He looked at me. He looked at the car, and we both knew. My girlfriend egged me on, saying, "Go on, you can do it, you can take him." So there I am, my first ever drive in a GTI, about to burn off this fat Merc. Boy racer stuff, but that was the thing about the GTI. It made your hair fizz, gave you a high, a real buzz. The lights changed, I dropped the clutch, and bang! We scorched down that road, leaving the Merc for dead. Trouble was, it would take 2 years to get right-hand drive GTIs back home.
One of the things people really liked about the Golf GTI was its simplicity. It had everything you needed and no junk, and that made it into a really essential tool. It was made for going, and it really did effectively go. I remember finding out pretty soon after the launch just how fast the Golf GTI was. Some of us were in Wales testing a Ferrari, 5-litre V12, 180-mile-an-hour car. And I was going to drive this thing pretty fast on some of these deserted roads, and I set off for about 20 minutes, driving as fast as I could, being chased by somebody in a Golf GTI. And I remember being severely embarrassed by just how quickly he arrived on the scene as soon as I'd stopped.
It was back in 1984. One of these Mark I GTIs came into the garage I was working at as part of a part exchange, and I had the job of checking the car over prior to it being resold. And obviously part of that was to take it out for a road test. It ended up being one of the longest road tests I'd ever given any car. It was quite an interesting experience. It was a revelation, really. I'd never driven anything like it. I'd driven a lot of cars at that time, and thought I knew what a good car was all about, but it wasn't until I drove one of these that I realised just how good they really are. In my view, they over-engineered the car from the factory, and it shows by the fact that so many of them have lasted so well in the condition that you still see them today, whereas the equivalent Ford would probably be on the scrap heap by now.
One of the most memorable things about motorway driving was how frustrating other drivers found the GTI. I remember that, you could very gently persuade BMW drivers to move out of the way as you steamed up behind them. And also one day a chap in a Ford Granada just threw his hands up and moved aside in complete frustration at the fact that he couldn't shake me from his tail.
Next to the GTI, the competition were like diesel locomotives. They were fragile, noisy, uncomfortable, and rusty. The GTI was the undisputed leader of the pack.
There were two really great things about the GTI. First, it could dance rings around cars that cost 10 times as much. And secondly, it flattered you. It made you think you were a good driver. Changing gear was like spooning honey. The seats just hugged you like a lover. The steering was a delight, and it went round corners like a banshee on a skateboard. In the 80s, I drove little else. I had 6 Mark I's in a row and loved them to bits. And then getting back into one 10 years later, you can see why they were just so remarkable. They really were the next best thing to Michelle Pfeiffer.
Suddenly, the GTI was the happening car of the 80s. Thrusting and quick-witted, it became an achiever's car, the ideal accessory for a decade obsessed with design, style and assertiveness. She told us to work hard, while she told us to pose hard. The GTI did both. Even the Americans, who usually preferred their cars the size of supertankers, wrote an open letter to Volkswagen begging them to sell GTIs in the States. Give Americans a reason, they implored, to leave their Porsches at home. But other car makers were chewing at VW's coattails. In 1980, Ford, impressed by the GTI's success, came up with a clone of their own, the XR3.
I think Ford definitely did copy the GTI concept with the XR3. They would probably admit it if they weren't, talking publicly. It was a very good idea. They could see the way the market responded to it, and they went at it as hard as they could go. The XR3 duly became the top-selling GTI car in Britain.
Even without fuel injection, the XR3 was turning heads, but the GTI seemed to be turning too many. It was a victim of its own success. If you couldn't afford one, you simply helped yourself. Those 3 emotive letters had become a liability. GTI now stood for Guaranteed Theft Item. From juveniles and joyriders to captains and colonels, the GTI's appeal was universal. Middle-class professionals admired its intelligent design and almost military precision. On a barracks in North London, we found 3, each fiercely admired by every age, sex and rank.
When I first drove the car, the acceleration was quite phenomenal compared to my previous Ford Escort, and I loved it. It's absolutely amazing, and also the top speed as well is quite high. But then I sort of thought about the car's engine and keeping it nice and changing the oil every 2,000 miles and all the rest of it. So I drive it around at a rather more sedate pace these days.
It was very fashionable amongst the military in the early 80s to have a Golf GTI, and any sort of guards mess you walked into had a line of black Golf GTIs lined up outside. I think they were popular because they had a bit of an image. They were the sort of first hot hatchback, they were sleek, they were nippy, and they were just a go-faster car.
My wife, whose car it actually is, I suppose, in theory, is very keen on the appearance, and I like that too, but the performance is its main claim to fame. Always was, and it had terrific reviews, as you know. And it's lived up to all of the expectations I had, even to the brakes, which are, as you know, distinctly iffy.
I've had about 9 GTIs so far, and most of them have gone to family, so my brothers have ended up with them. One brother's got 1, the other brother's got 2. My brother-in-law's got 1, his girlfriend's got 1, my wife's got 1, I've got 1.
And here's a small selection from the family fleet. Peter's obsession means that ownership is almost compulsory amongst his nearest and dearest. They all agree it's a fine car, but it's one that can rule your life.
Probably the chief drawback of the car is they're such fun that you really do get hooked on them, and the enthusiasm just takes off. And so when Pete and I get together, we just tend to end up talking about nothing else.
It depends whether you actually gas blow the inlet manifold as well, doesn't it?
And do something with the exhaust manifold.
When Paul and I go around to see Pete and Mary, the main topic of conversation is going to be golfs, and the magazines come out, and it's just so boring. What more can I say?
Don't put a full branch on because I don't really think they last that long.
Well, the problem with that is they're noisy.
Yeah,
if you don't change the engine mounts, they crack.
Yeah, the tedious bit of it all is really when you realise that the only thing that goes on in their heads that's the priority are GTIs.
I kept thinking she got the 13-inch 9 spokes on.
No, because she changed, didn't she, after I got mine?
So you put the Pirelli P wheels on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it gives us clearance.
But if you think that's obsessive behaviour, you haven't heard the half of it. Modifying Mark I GTIs has become a street cult. You name it, they change it. But why gild a lily that doesn't need gilding?
I think really it's down to a basic sadness in my makeup. Initially, I bought my Mark I Golf GTI as a cheap, durable, quick car, just to get my boy race out of my system. Unfortunately, I fell in love with a car and what it could do, and I wanted more.
It has its own individuality. There are, even with, say, XR3s or such other vehicles, they just don't have the individuality.
Because I like to improve the car in every aspect, and it just looks so much better and handles better. When you lower it, make it go faster, stop better.
The Mark I GTI is the original and best of all the hot hatch bikes, and I just try to make something that's already the best better.
But some reckon that the best should not be bettered, that the original GTI in its purest form is an emergent classic.
This car is a classic car. 3 reasons. Classic Car magazine listed as an insurable classic. I have insured it as a classic because it's over 10 years old, and they are now becoming very hard to get, and people come up to me in the street and say, will you sell it? That is a classic car.
To their credit, Volkswagen never lost sight of what made the GTI great. They spent a whole hill of money making the Mark II more refined, but managed to keep most of its personality and panache. And the latest City Slick Mark III might ooze modernity, but it can still trace its bloodline all the way back to that matchless Mark I of '76.
The Mark I Golf GTI was the first cheap performance car that you did not have to suffer to own. And that is why it started a trend which endures today. And it will endure for another 20 years. I don't see why not.
The GTI revolutionized the way we think about little cars. It was the first, the finest and the most widely imitated small, fast car in the world. It gave high-tech handling and budget performance to millions of motorists. It might not have wire wheels or leather seats, be low, snorty or multi-carburetted, but it's a real classic in the truest sense of the word. You didn't really think we were going to drop it, did you? If only all cars were as enduring as a GTI.